Well, welcome. We'll get started with this event. I'm very, very excited to have this event here. I'm super excited to seeing new faces of our friends and colleagues from the art and education realm. So thank you for being here. My name is Mark Diaz. I'm the Associate Director of Education at CAPE, overseeing in-school programs and exhibitions here. It's a delight to have you join us tonight in CAPE's exhibition space. This place is dedicated to the exploration of arts integration. Throughout the year, we showcase student creativity and aesthetic experimentation. More importantly, our exhibits display artworks and process documentation from classrooms, offering insights into student thinking and curiosity. Each exhibition deepens our understanding of the intersection of art making and learning, advancing our work with teachers and artists to provide greater access to the arts in schools and making learning more accessible to young people. Exhibiting student art processes also makes students' learning visible. This current exhibition, Moments, Movements, and Manifestations, features process documentation from arts integration projects across 7 schools. These schools participated in our CoLab program from fall 2023 to spring 2025. CoLab, CAPE's foundational arts integration program, brings together a cohort of teachers and teaching artists over 2 years to develop their arts integration practice. Initiated in 2002, CoLab was created to expand CAPE's network, pardon me, I don't have a podium, of long-term partnerships. By the numbers, we've formed partnerships with over 110 CPS schools, introduced arts integration methodology to over 200 teacher and teaching artist teams. And those teams co-created arts integrated projects with over 7,000 students. The majority of these schools comprise our current long-term partnerships throughout CAPE. While cultivating new partnerships across the city, we also thoroughly researched our methodology, an essential part of every CAPE program. For over 2 decades, CoLab has allowed us to examine how arts integration partnerships develop and consider the evolving conditions that foster strong collaborations. In this exhibition, process documentation is presented alongside text excerpts from our researchers' report. Rather than visually organizing projects through textual descriptions, Moments, Movements, and Manifestations invites you to make your own connections between the floating text and the projects. This evening, our researchers will share their findings and patterns they have identified within the program. Tonight's dialogue is titled The Roles of Documentation in Arts Integration Partnerships. Joining us from New Mexico is Dr. Gigi Schroeder Yu, who has been with us since the very beginning of CAPE's research program. Dr. Yu is Associate Professor of Art Education and the College of Fine Arts Interim Associate Dean of Research at the University of New Mexico. She has over 25 years of experience collaborating with young children, adults, and educators in various art-related settings, such as art museums, community-based art contacts, and public school settings. Dr. Yu's work focuses on Reggio Emilia methodology, which emphasizes the importance of children's artistic languages. Gigi is also the co-founder of Collaborative Teachers Institute, a community of practice that co-constructs interdisciplinary aesthetic inquiries based on the interests of families, children, and educators. Her research as a writer and co-editor has been featured in numerous international publications. Dr. Juana Reyes is an associate professor in early childhood special education at Lewis University. She has worked with multilingual families in Chicago and Phoenix, Arizona. She is a founding member and chair of Crossroads for Learning, an organization that works to connect educators as they seek to understand and apply principles and practices of the Reggio Emilia approach. Dr. Reyes is also a consulting editor for Innovations, published by the North American Reggio Emilia Alliance. She, along with Gigi, was co-editor of Affirming the Rights of Emergent Bilingual and Multilingual Children and Families. Streaming with us from Phoenix, Arizona, is Dr. Patricia Goubeaux, founder, CEO of DCG Enterprises, and a former college educator turned researcher, consultant coach, and executive administrator. From 2018 through 2023, Dr. Goubeaux served as researcher evaluator of a Reggio-inspired professional development program for the Center for Early Childhood Education at Paradise Valley Community College in Phoenix. She was co-founder and president of Odyssey for Peace, an NGO dedicated to transnational partnerships and violence prevention education, where she spent 7 months in post-war Bosnia, working with government leaders and university students to establish virtual cross-cultural student exchanges and a sister city relationship between Toledo, Ohio, Banja Luka, and Banja Luka Republika Srpska. And then we have Dr. Erin Preston, an educational researcher and former arts educator, draws upon 8 years of teaching visual and digital art. Dr. Preston's professional experience includes working with the Chicago Humanities Festival, the University of Illinois at Chicago, and Project Zero on program evaluation and research. Erin has also conducted research on several CAPE programs, including our established partners in the Artist Researcher Partners Program. Erin's research centers on tensions of knowing, trust, and values in adult and student collaborative learning in a variety of contexts, including professional development settings and arts-integrated classrooms. She earned a Master of Education in Arts Education from Harvard. It's going to keep rolling.
We're good.
And she recently received her PhD from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Tonight, Erin will also thread together her perspectives on the program with the current CoLab research. So now I'll turn it over to Erin.
Great. And we'll say temporarily farewell to Patricia. She will be here though. Okay. So I worked with Collaboration Laboratory from 2016 to 2021. And I just wanted to say thank you to CAPE for bringing this all together, because it's been really valuable to go back and revisit the research and to have the opportunity to understand it anew in conversation with you all. So in my research, the trajectory followed the phenomena of collaboration, primarily focusing on the relationship between the teaching artist and the teacher, and how they constructed shared knowledge both in the classroom inquiry with students and in their emerging inquiry around arts-integrated pedagogical practices. So I come to this work with a foundational theory that tension or contradictions and paradoxes are just part of social activity. They're just part of our lives, and they never get resolved. They kind of shift as we shift our own activity and as the systems that we live and work within shift as well. At CAPE, as partners undertake their collaboration into planning and implementing arts integration, their disciplinary training and knowledge can result in competing perceptions and interpretations of their work and their goals. Further, the systems that they work within create very different norms. So the resulting tensions are what creates both conflict and the opportunity for growth, and what defines the partnerships model for CAPE as well. So what if we look at the typical structure in schools Teachers leading a unit where they concretely define the process and procedures. Students typically follow the same 1, 2, 3, and 4 process where they know what 4 as a landing spot will be and the steps to get there, and this is not bad, right? There's a lot of variation in what this looks like in the classroom. But this process is undergirded by values to work within constrained time, certainty, ease of assessment, and uniform activity that support the very real demands on teachers. Now I'm going to offer a few metaphors to consider and compare this model intention when arts integrated inquiry disrupts that process. So here we see arts integration as starling murmuration. The collective and individual are moving together with shifting leadership and enough space for individual movement in relation to others towards a carefully attuned and emerging direction with evolving formation. And now we're going to consider arts integration as rhizomes, a la Deleuze and Guattari. So here we see a cross-section of a rhizomatic growth habit, where there's multiplicity in direction and leadership is decentralized. Roots seek out nutrients to feed their own learning or growth, where inquiry can continue forever. All is connected and sustaining the whole plant, or as Mark has recently brought in, the idea of the roots burrowing deeper into inquiry, their own inquiry again as connected to the whole. So in my research, main tensions emerged as central concerns for teachers and teaching artists. And I'm sure you'll hear these, and I know you'll hear these, surface within the research of my colleagues over here. I'm going to go through these one by one. Structure and agency. So Catterall and Waldorf in 1999 described how the teacher must learn to live with some unpredictability brought by the artist. The artist must learn to accept the necessary structure brought by the teacher. So way back when James Catterall and Lynn Waldorf worked with CAPE on the Imagination Project, this is what they shared, but I have come to disagree with this interpretation, and I'm going to offer that teachers and teaching artists both use structures and boundaries, but they often use different ones for very different purposes. As one teacher shared, students are used to right and wrong answers because that's what they're programmed to do. It took a long time to let that go. And that's true for both students and teachers and teaching artists when they go in spaces and try to navigate these tensions and differences. And as one teaching artist recently said this last year in an artist researcher program, that she believes that this very difference is why teachers keep coming back, because simply starting with an inquiry question immediately disrupts the known, known process and the structures that it constrains. Next, process and product. It is just opposite of how we think as teachers, of knowing this is where we want to be and working backwards to get there. This also relates to structure and agency, and many of these concepts overlap. Additionally, this is from a teaching artist. I used to focus on turning out products that looked more like art instead of building environments where people really, really needed to share for it to work. When I realized I had no control, the thing that made the most sense was to empower students more. That feels like a permanent shift here. And this quote is from the pandemic. So very different structures that we were working within. But because of that shift, the teaching artist was able to pull the feeling of empowering students through structures to enable them to shape the inquiry with much more power. Trust and disclosure. This is from a teaching artist. If both people trust each other, then this could be like a ride that no one really knows where it goes, as opposed to being like, this is when it dips, this is when this happens. Both people are clinging to each other like, all right, okay, here we go. So in early stage partnerships, like in CoLab, partners must be vulnerable in sharing openly before they've had experiences of being accepted by each other, as well as to provide and accept critical feedback to grow in a shared arts-integrated pedagogy. In an arts inquiry-based process with emergent curriculum, trust and disclosure are continually navigated. And lastly, certainty and uncertainty, and this is a quote from the late and beloved Scott Sikkema. If the artist and teacher are really collaborating in such a way that they're questioning how they're teaching, you can tell when people are authentically debating different social, history, math ideas. If they're up there together debating and questioning these things, it starts to help the students to think about the content, not just as something that they memorize and give back, but instead the content is something that they have ownership of and investigate in their own way. So how do teachers and teaching artists make sense of these tensions and use them as a resource for professional growth and inquiry? So one of the ways I aimed to understand that question was to explore moments where teachers and teaching artists engage in episodes of pedagogic reasoning. So that is to say the how and the why of their work. How are we making sense of our instructional practices? And I analyzed these instances of framing, how they identified challenges and solutions. On the left, we see an image from professional development of partners embodying their collaboration through movement. They did a continuous navigation of responsiveness, vulnerability, and adjustments, and attuning to each other. This navigation expands how they relate to both students and the broader learning environment with each other. And partnerships, because there are two educators from different backgrounds with different expertise and norms, this can facilitate the reframing of situations because authority is disrupted in the shared framing process. And this can bring values into open discussion and enable partners to see the system that they were working within much more clearly. In my work, I found that a close examination of these episodes of pedagogical reasoning and the space to process them through interviews. So the space to process these tensions and how they were framing them through interviews can illuminate the limits and potentials of framing as site for expansive transitions. And this can fuel a shared professional inquiry that sustains the partnerships. And in this slide, I wanted to share more of the voices of teachers and teaching artists to capture more how the inquiry into the generative tensions led to counter-framing challenges from placing issues on students or within students to the broader context of schooling norms and classroom conditions. So on the left are the words of one partnership describing their shared commitments from a No manifesto that was inspired by Yvonne Rainier. This was in a professional development activity. No to limited and limitless. No to the end, no to defeat and competition, no to singularity, no to only one expert, and no to time limits and time. And I'm going to provide two more quotes, one from a teaching artist and teacher, just to show a little bit more about what problem was identified and how through their work they counter-framed it as a more systemic issue that they were adjusting within their collaborative work together. The students did get there and just took an extra 3.5 minutes, so the teacher wouldn't have given him a 4. My son asked. It was a 4 out of 5 rubric for getting a score and points on an assignment. Because he couldn't get there by himself. But when you're an artist, you don't really get places by yourself. Arguably, none of us get anywhere by ourselves. So this teaching artist quote illuminates the generative tensions that fueled their pedagogical inquiry between process and product, with how students are graded, how schools privilege time efficiency, and between valuing either individual learning or a collective learning process, a collective-oriented learning process. And the next quote, this is from a physics teacher, a high school physics teacher. The students are, just tell me what I have to do to get it done. This across the board. Which are the problems. A lot of times they want me to micro-list a rubric, so they do everything on the rubric. I don't know if it has to do with them. Maybe with everything that's going on now with this constant pressure to get things done, and they don't have the time to play around. They don't have the time to be creative, and that's something my students said. So through their inquiry, they were working on what structures students need to really agentively engage in creative inquiry in the classroom. And this is especially important for a science teacher who came to really understand how the school norms were in conflict with her commitments to inquiry, and how rigorous inquiry can be generated through arts integration, and what processes really support that. And she learned that from and with her teaching artist partner and her students, and how they engaged with the different structures she created in their work. So in that work, teachers were negotiating that understanding of how to counterframe challenges related to systemic norms, and their projects push them in consequential ways out of routine. For teaching artists, it enabled them to locate how their practices create structures for student agency, and reinforce their commitments to value dignity, collective learning, participatory practices, and many of the things that we dive more deeply in through the Artist Researcher Program as they continue their work. And we view these tensions as really generative, but a lot of these are much more invisible. They happen internally, and then through trust and disclosure in dialogue, or through research activity, through interviews, and in their digital documentation sometimes. But when we are going to shift now over to the research team and the work that was undertaken the past 4 years, as it evolved, we're going to look a little bit more tangibly and concretely.
Because our team started to work with CoLab in, I think it was 2022, right?
It's 21, 22.
Really? Was it 2021?
Yeah.
Okay,
22, yeah.
somewhere in there. But it was actually it was shortly after kids had returned to the classroom, to the classroom. So that it did also impact us as researchers, because if it was difficult to go into classrooms as researchers before COVID, during COVID it was you couldn't. It was impossible to go in and do any sort of observation as researchers. So that we made the decision to just interview the teaching artists at that time. Also, it was hard to even access teachers. So to just focus on what was happening with teaching artists in the CoLab project. So it did, you can even see in this slide, kids are wearing masks in the images. So this first year of the research, we were interviewing 2 teaching artists and their experiences, but they were also, it was right after they came back into the classroom, where everyone was meeting in person again. So I think that impacted the research in that way, but yeah. So during this first year of our research teams looking at CoLab, we started to use this conceptual framework of ecology of practices to describe the kinds of practices that are cultivated within the CAPE network. And these practices of documentation, shared inquiry, co-teaching, looking at transdisciplinary research, and the artist researcher framework is what we were referring to as the ecology of practices, as cultivated in the CAPE network, and then within each of the contexts where teaching artists are working in classrooms, the way that those practices are then reinterpreted or replayed out look different. So they're different based on the context, yet they're all connected within the network. So it became very interesting for us the way that teaching artists were using similar kinds of language and describing, but doing things in different ways. So that I think that was part of that initial year, was calling attention to those kinds of practices, the interconnected, and also that these practices grow in relationship to each other, and as teaching artists are sharing their practices with each other across context, then there's like a deepening of understanding of what those practices mean. But we can go to the next slide. So the following year, during this time that we were looking at the ecology of practices, one of the big ideas, I will say, that came up was this idea of looking at specifically at documentation closer, like looking deeper at how is documentation a part of the teaching partnerships? What is the role of documentation? And now I'm going to step backwards for a minute. I'm going to go way back 20 years to actually, to speak a little bit more about my relationship and Juana's relationship to CAPE. Actually started back in like 2000. I was working closely with Scott Sikkema on several projects, and one of the things that Scott and I were both very interested in was documentation. And Scott at that time was thinking about, well, how can documentation be a part of the teaching partnerships and the inquiry building. So this is actually, this is from an email that Scott sent to me in 2023, shortly before he passed away. And I was saying to Scott, like, I still want to have these conversations with you about documentation. This is how Scott and I would think, right? Like, everyone's like, that sounds like such a fun conversation. But these are the things we were talking about. And in this quote, he was talking about how he was remembering for me, like the connection between CAPE and documentation. Sorry, we need to hold it closer.
As well,
and
right?
Chicago Commons. So CAPE staff came to where Juana and I were working at Chicago Commons, which is a Reggio-inspired early childhood program. And in the study of Reggio Emilia approach would use documentation for building inquiry, but also in making learning visible. This is a very old documentation panel from Chicago Commons on this slide. And Scott said the somewhat vague notion floating about was that documentation could help with this idea of classrooms becoming demonstration sites that would help us, but he had no thoughts of how to engage with that. So he set up an opportunity to come to Chicago Commons with staff to look at how the documentation panels on the wall were making visible the inquiries that were happening in the classroom. And he said there the partners could directly see the impact of physical documentation, the whole Reggio notion of the third teacher, and how it communicates with parents and other children, how it can be interactive, and how it moves curriculum. And I think that's really the key thing, is how documentation can help move a curriculum, and how this idea that it's interactive, so it's not just hanging artworks on the wall, but it's moving curriculum, but it's also, as a viewer, you're interacting with it also. So the CAPE teaching partners began working on their own physical documentation back at their sites, and then shared these displays in the late that spring. I was a part of a lot of those workshops at that time. That was many years ago. And that was sort of a seed of an idea, but also as I started to come back into working with CAPE in 2021, what we might research together again to go back and look at that idea of what is the role of documentation in the partnerships. So that's kind of how we got to that in a long story, how we got to that original question. So Juana's now going to talk a little bit about this work that we're seeing on the walls, but this idea of studying documentation deeper.
So the last two, it's okay, I'm fine, yeah. So the last 2 school years, we looked at, we developed this idea of moments, movements, and manifestations. So this is a 2023-24 and 24-25 school year. And we used, to come to this, we're going to talk a little bit more about this meaning of moments, movements, and manifestations. But to come to this, we used, the framework that we used was narrative inquiry. And the nice thing about this approach is that it really respects the voices of each of the participants. So the adults within the classroom, the children or students in the classroom, as well as the researchers. So that's a little bit of why we kind of reflected back on 20 years prior, because when we think about an ecology of practice, there's all of this sorts of threads and layers that pull through. So the other thing, it respects their story and the voices of each participant. Thanks. And so with that, we came to that, this was our second and third year of looking at documentation, and we came to this question of, do documentation practices inform the dynamic planning processes and collaboration among students, teachers, and artists in the CoLab classrooms? And if so, how? So that was the beginning question that we looked at.
So some of the ways that we noticed documentation, what documentation was for in the teaching processes was this idea of process, both being used for the process of an inquiry, but also the content. So that documentation, again, moves curriculum forward. So in these slides, in this slide you see children interacting with their own forms of documentation, which we're going to talk a little bit more about, but also children documenting of the neighborhood. So the content of documenting, that they were documenting the neighborhood and what they were seeing, became the content for the artwork itself. And then, of course, the exhibition, this was in 2024, this exhibition, but then the documentation becomes also the content for the exhibition. That documentation is also for the shared inquiry. It moves the curriculum forward in this building of an inquiry together, the teaching artist, the classroom teacher, and of course the children. And also that documentation that in the professional development, CAPE partnerships, teaching artists and classroom teacher are also learning about documentation, that they're experiencing documentation as a way to think deeper about how it could be used. So in this image, this was part of a professional development initiative where they were documenting the environment.
Okay. So one of the things that influenced us as researchers when we came into the project is that we didn't have access to teachers because we were in in the pandemic, and there was kind of a protected status around research and so we didn't have access to interview students or teachers or what have you. So we had to look really closely at the professional development framework, and what we learned is that there were so many layers. So kind of this idea of big ideas, past inquiries, and future possibilities then would move into the inquiry question and this idea of embracing uncertainty and the collaborative co-teaching and collaborative inquiry, and then it would cycle back around. So there were all of these layers in terms of before the CoLab partners went into classrooms, there was a lot of front-loading of professional development, and it was extremely respectful in that the CAPE really wanted to kind of cultivate that collaborative relationship with the teaching artist and the teacher in the classroom. And so that, evolved over the fall, and then what unfolded in the spring is what happened in terms of the inquiry process.
I just want to say something else about why we were so intrigued by this idea of past partnerships sharing the documentation of their projects with these new CoLab partnerships. Because it's also it's thinking about whatever was happening in the partnership from the experience, partners, the experiences with the children, with the students, was actually influencing the future partnerships. So it's not just the teaching artist and the classroom teacher, but it's actually the children themselves are influencing the next generation of partnerships. I think that was really inspiring for us.
And then, so to talk more specifically about the 3M framework, so moments, movement, and manifestation is something we developed over the course of the last couple of years. And it really became a framework or a lens through which we gathered this sort of understanding of what was happening. So there might be a moment that might take place that was documented, but it wasn't realized until there was a revisiting of that moment, either through notes from the teacher or the teaching artist, or a photograph that might have been taken, or a drawing that a child made, something of that ilk. Like, it might have been a very, at the time, an insignificant moment, but the relationship of going back and looking at that moment and reflecting upon it then became a catalyst for how to go deeper and where to go along the journey next. And so that became the movement of the kind of waves coming out from the initial impact or the disruption. And then also thinking about then the manifestation, that cyclical back. So, yeah.
Okay. So in this past year, we've considered how this idea of manifestation, taking what happened the first year of the partnership, and then manifesting into the next year, what is manifested. And we, after reviewing the documentation and the interviews for this coming year, we started to see how that the teaching artists were speaking around these ideas of dichotomies or differences, things that were an opposite of each other, but also both necessary to create a shared context with the classrooms. So the exhibition actually reflects these dichotomies that we're going to share now in the next few slides. But this relationship between documentation and the emergence or the becoming of a shared space is what was revealed in the documentation, this process of co-constructing.
So to start the exploration into the dichotomies, I found a connection between my research with the Artist Researcher program and time for you. So I found that in the Artist Researcher program that teaching artists were using time as a material to restructure how it organizes activity. One way was reorganizing time for students to not get it right. As one teaching artist shared, I think it really has to do about creating an environment where they know that they're probably going to fail and that it's not about the end product, it's about their relationship with the materials and whatever that might be for them, and it's going to be something different than what they think. So really giving the time and space for students to reorient their learning towards not one specific answer, but engaging in a connective learning experience for themselves. And then the next one, time to make projects their own through extended code-creative relationships with materials. So time to make projects their own. As one teaching artist shared, once they find their hook, they're not questioning themselves as much because they have their own internal vision. They're at that point. They're in their own time. They're 100% there now. And so time emerged in your work too. Can you discuss that finding and what teachers, teaching artists, and students learned, or what you learned about their relationship to time, and how they might have used it as a structure?
So the dichotomy that we noticed teaching artists speaking of is how time is both structured, and there's also an importance of flow of time, that both of those are needed in the new shared context that they're creating with children and the teacher. That there's a need for, on one hand, planned time, like very structured planned time, but also the need for play, for ideas to emerge through playfulness or free-flowingness. If you go to the next slide, I can show what that looks like. One teaching artist referred to this, she used the terminology a score, which I thought was really interesting to talk about what a planning document could look like. Something you use in dance, music, or theater, and it can be pretty specific. We didn't plan each day. We make a schedule down to the minute of how we were going to work through things, but instead we made bullet points of what we would want to hit on, knowing that's the score for the day. So I think it was interesting terminology to use to describe, looking at the list that they would create as the score. And at the end of the class, the teacher and I would meet and discuss everything we wanted to address the following week. The teacher and I are both really malleable. If we were more like, we need to set it up and not change it, it would have been challenging. So we were both constantly renegotiating, improvising based on the information in the moment. So this need to be flexible and improvise, yet have a score, like have a plan. And I think that sometimes, in teaching art, you can, sometimes people are like, oh, just let them do whatever they want with the materials. But no, you actually need a plan. You need to have structure and plan. And that on this slide also is the dialogue. Some of the teaching artists shared how they would text back and forth plans. So planning happened in all these emergent kind of ways also in between session. And then on the next, go ahead, thank you. The next slide, this shows more of this idea of flow or playfulness as being necessary in the shared context. This teaching artist said, we read stories, then reflected on the issues children were struggling with and how their character would come in to solve a problem. They, the children, started writing their own stories, but some got stuck and frustrated, and we did some improvisation until one of the children asked, can we just get started? We let go, and they began creating headdresses. The characters emerged through the art making. So this need to have like playfulness with the materials so that the materials and the children together can start having ideas emerge rather than having too much structure and too much planning. These are a few other quotes about the same idea of teaching artists referring to being like a fluidity, which comes with movement, like malleable and shape-shifting, is something that I feel strongly about and think of as an arts educator, which is something I've done for a very long time. That's how I appreciate teaching as well. I approach teaching in a similar way where I'm adapting the interests, talents, and curiosities of those in the room. I love that the language of like fluidity, malleableness, shape-shifting. Another teaching artist said, the kids actually know how they learn. Like as if we step back and allow the children to take over or to have their own point of view in the plan, that they sometimes they know how to figure something out in ways that we wouldn't assume. And then the last one, letting children lead allowed us to document more. So instead of having to feel like overly controlling of the situation, if the children were allowed to lead more, then the teaching artist and the teacher had more time to actually photograph or video record or write down things that children were saying and doing. Another one of the dichotomies is the contrast between concrete and an inquiry is concrete and also abstract. So in some ideas, the teaching artists were talking about specific curriculum that were used in the schools that they needed to work with in their inquiry projects together. So this bridging of the school curriculum expectations with artistic practices to then create something that's transdisciplinary. So in these dichotomies, what we're saying is that both of these things exist within the shared context, but not one is more important to the other. So in this coming together of the dichotomies that creates new possibilities. Okay, and this was an interesting example of how creating this shared context, how the teaching artist was taking documentation from her own art practice, from her art context, and bringing that to the school context to bridge this science curriculum. The science curriculum was suggesting that the students, in studying the concept of light and shadow, to make shadow puppets, but in the way that the science curriculum wrote about it, it was very didactic and it was very concrete and not very exploratory or not even about emotions. It was more this scientific edge. But so the teaching artist is like, wait, this is what I do. I study light and shadow is my work. And so she was sharing documentation of her work with the classroom teacher to think about then what's possible within the realm of shadow puppetry, which is limited in the first grade science curriculum to expand the ideas. And the teaching artist said, I was thinking in conceptual ways, but the teacher was thinking very practically and literally. I was really interested more in abstractions, but we found this middle ground. So like right there, like that's, in saying that the middle ground is actually this merging together of these two dichotomies.
So we need a teaching artist in every room.
Yeah.
Yes.
All over the world. I mean, every room, right? Yeah.
For the next dichotomy, there was a big connection for me. So role shifting is a huge part of the artist researcher model. And in the artist researcher program, I found that in order for role shifting to happen, there needs to be a continuous attunement to how power is manifesting in learning between teachers, teaching artists, and their students. In order to shift participation for students to take up more agency in their learning. So I'm going to read two little quotes from that research, and then that'll connect with what you studied and saw within the CoLab partnerships these past few years. So a teaching artist shared, as far as role shifting is going, if I get more square, some of my longtime partners will get more weird, which is great. And if you have that long-term partnership with a teacher, probably means they can tolerate your level of expansiveness, but often they need someone to make them feel safe so they can reach that. So what did you learn about role shifting?
I love that idea of the feeling safe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that was like, that pulls through in this idea of the relationship between intention as a novice or intention as expertise, where in these partnerships sometimes it's important for for someone to take the lead in having expertise, but in other situations how it's important to step back and be the learner. And this means the teaching artist being a learner, the classroom teacher being a learner, also the students being learners, and how those roles can move, can move back and forth. But was it trustworthiness they said? And
They can trust.
something like that.
They can feel safe.
Safe,
They can
feeling
reach that.
safe, yeah. The way we described it is that this requires a sense of trust to be vulnerable, recognizing when to step back and when to lead, when to document, and when to be the subject of documentation. So as an example, you can go to the next slide. These are some of the quotes from the teaching artists about the ways that what they saw teachers documenting, and how the relationship between what the teacher was photographing and what the teacher was noticing. So this teaching artist is saying, I was photographing moments that I thought captured what we were doing, what we were going for. But the teacher also had some things that she was interested in sharing too. Like the teacher was noticing the interactions between the students because she knows them. So the teaching artist is saying, like, the teacher knows the students better than I do, and that she's noticing things that I don't. Another teaching artist said, the teacher took more photos than I did because often I was in the process of demonstrating. So she documented the whole process. So the teaching artist is allowed to be the expert while demonstrating, while the teacher is also documenting the process. The teacher and I are documenting what we see with our own eyes and discussing how the lesson is going. So in this example, they're speaking of how they both are documenting. This was a lovely quote by one of the teaching artists that said, there are moments where there's like this breath of just a pause, and the teacher will turn to me and she'll look at a photograph that a student took of himself and be like, oh, wow. She'll share something about the students that maybe I don't know because I pop in and out, and she has a relationship with the students. She sees them more often and will look at a photograph of a student and see the student in a certain way that I don't know. So that's very cool to have these moments.
Okay, so what we've been describing is very different than typical classroom activity. There's a lot more physical movement around the space. There's what's described as like productive loudness in the classroom from students, and it can feel really chaotic at first for teachers who are not used to student-driven inquiry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a quote from a teacher about how they kind of counterframed some of these differences, and then toss it to you about what you learned about these tensions as well. Teachers shared, "I had a moment of clarity, and I have to remember because sometimes I describe myself as organized chaos, so it may look one way, but there's a lot of learning going on here. Students are focused. They have an objective, they're sticking to that objective, and when it's time to clean up, we'll clean up. But right now, let's do what we need to do, and let's learn, and let's literally get our hands dirty. I have to take a step back, because sometimes you have to realize what's comfortable for you might not be what's best for your students." So she was recognizing that she could see some of that organized chaos in herself, whereas in the classroom, she really likes everybody to be doing synchronous activity, and then realize that's okay for me in some spaces, that's okay for my students too, and kind of trusting that. So what did you learn about how the documentation process supports teachers to kind of trust in this different activity in their classrooms?
Well, I think that documentation, in response to that question, when you document something, you learn in ways that you wouldn't have otherwise. I think it causes you to pay attention to things that maybe you didn't otherwise. So I think teachers being involved in the documentation process, like those quotes from those teaching artists also about that the teacher is noticing things that they don't notice as a teaching artist. I think that's really interesting. I think it's also what this last one is describing is the dichotomy of process and formation. That documentation it slows down an art inquiry or an art making process because you're thinking about all these steps it takes to get to something, and you're documenting it. So it causes you to slow down and pay attention to all the steps to get somewhere and all the different ways that you can document. I think what we noticed in the second year of these partnerships was the complexity of the kinds of documentation that the partnerships were doing. Like thinking of all these, this is from one project that's over on that wall over there, I believe, behind the wall of these, the children were creating these identity boxes, but you can't just create an identity box without having this slow down process of identifying who you are. So there are all these processes of identifying, and the partnership, they were also looking at how you understand yourself because you're in relation to someone else. So some of these is the children were interviewing each other and documenting what they were saying to each other about themselves, and then they would check back and say, is this what you meant to say about yourself? And so the interviewing became documenting, and also the teaching artist said this quote is photography is like a million words. And this is one of my favorite photographs of all the documentation where they're playing a telephone game where they whisper something in each other's ear and they pass on a saying or something. But this practicing listening to one another as also being a part of building identity, who you are. And I love that photograph. I think it's so sweet. It really shows this deep listening to each other as a part of identity. And then this is, again, all the different process. This is the example on the wall of the shadow play that was created, and all of the steps that went into creating the shadow play, all the documentation of the process, and including the children creating their own journals. This teaching artist said, I received more feedback and information as an educator on how each student processes information differently once they had a creative space to write or to draw about what they were thinking, feeling, and experiencing. So giving children these spaces to, to create and draw what their ideas are as a part of the process. And this next slide, this shows one of the other forms of documentation that really came out was journaling, and how each of these projects had used journaling for the teaching artists. Like the last one talks about the teaching artists using a personal journal, and that we also had the kids keep a journal, and they would prompt questions for them to explore in their journals. I love that first quote also about every student had a little book with each question or each theme or each inquiry question, so that children could be like writing down their, keeping in their, documenting in their own journal spaces.
So again, thinking about art making as process and also as formation. So something that Gigi and I have looked at in the past is this whole idea of the process, but also the content of documentation, that it's that there's a two-part process. And the other thing I want to point out in preparing for today, again, I kind of revisited the next generation science standards, so the NGSS. And so when you look at the science standards for first graders, which these are, they do talk about this idea of light and what have you. And it was very one-dimensional compared to, and they have some experiences that they, suggest or what have you. But the layers that are within this project are much beyond, of the light and shadow. And I'm going to play this
There's
much.
no video.
Oh, there isn't a video.
It's just a photo.
Oh,
There's
okay.
a video on the wall over there.
Okay, great. There is a video on the wall over there,
Yeah.
so you can check it out. But just the level of communication that the children had to have, so they, both in language arts standards as well as science standards and math standards, so looking at both scale, developing different characters, and writing this theatrical performance, and then also building this understanding. First they looked at just light and shadow, and then they added color, and then they had to figure out how to layer different color films to come with the color that they had envisioned within the sea or outside of the sea, right? And so they had to really, there was a lot of critical thinking and collaboration that was happening within that as well. So you could see that, here
sorry.
they're practicing.
I
Yeah,
was
go
turning
ahead.
it back. Do you
No,
want me to
go
go
ahead.
back then?
Actually, no, keep going. Can you go back a little bit? Wait, just one.
Okay.
Yes,
To
then
this
they
one?
can see the, one more.
Yeah,
There,
that one.
that's like all the things you're talking about.
Yep.
So we'll just end with this. This was one of the last conversations I think we had with Scott, and he shared, we were talking about why we were doing this research, like why do we do research? And that's one of the things that I always loved about CAPE, is that you do research. You don't just do projects, you like research the project to then understand what just happened and what's the value of what we're doing here. And I wrote down this quote that Scott said, "Research is valuable when it moves us along to explore new questions." So I think that's a valuable thing for us to consider in this work, of how this research with CoLab can move us to explore new questions.
So as researchers, I wanted to offer you the question of talking a little bit about some of these dichotomies in your own work as three individuals coming from different experiences and backgrounds, and how that influenced your research process.
I'm going to turn it to Patricia on the line there.
Hi, Patricia.
Can you see me, hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I've thoroughly enjoyed having this step back to look at this wonderful work we've been doing. So with that question, I think I'm in Arizona, which is right now a 2-hour time difference. Gigi's in New Mexico, and then Juana's in Chicago. So I would say just from that kind of time perspective, it has been a challenge. And then, everybody has busy schedules, so you add that to different time zones. So and I think we've just learned how to fit in and kind of flow with everyone's, how we come at it differently. And, and I think we come at time differently. What I've seen is Gigi and Juana are much more last minute people than I am. I'm more of an introvert, and so I'm one that needs to step back and think, and I watch them just process things right on the spot, and I'm in awe. So I think that's been a difference. I will also say I'm definitely the novice in this project. I had been doing evaluations and research for a long time, but can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
I came into this work with Gigi and Juana when they were working here in Arizona. And then Gigi invited me to be a part of this collaborative team. And, but it has been it's my first introduction to CAPE. And it's been a steep learning curve, a wonderful learning curve. So I just certainly felt the vulnerability of being a novice.
Thank you. We're at time. That was a great conversation. Thank you. Thanks, Patricia, for hanging out with us digitally.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I want
Thank you for allowing me to be a little part of this. Could I just add that as we talked about vulnerability, one of the things that occurred to me is that how the vulnerability of the teaching artists as they come into this environment, and as they all said more than once, we come into a space that we know we're the outsider, and so just what it takes to develop that rapport with the teachers, I think, is an important piece of the work.
Yes, thank you. I think that learning spaces, when we develop trust and vulnerability, we get to understand like how we can make new meaning. So that's great, and something that we can talk about in the next few minutes as a group, because you're still welcome to hang out and have some refreshments with us. And thanks again to Patricia, Erin, Juana, and Gigi. Thank you all.